A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chao Hui Sing, a student from the Faculty of Business. Welcome to You Alive, organized by the NUS Office of Alumni Relations. You Alive, Lifting Thought Leadership is a quarterly speaker series that features global thought leaders and captains of the industries who will share their personal journeys and engage in an open dialogue. Each speaker will have 30 minutes to share about a topic close to their hearts, followed by a 20-minute interview with our moderator, Mr. Viswan Sedasvan, and end with a 40-minute Q&A session. For our Q&A session, you may make your way to the microphones placed along the aisles, introduce yourself, and speak directly into them. This is essential so that our online community is able to hear your questions. Today, we'll be using Pigeonhole Live for our Q&A sessions. If you have a smartphone, a laptop, a tablet, just launch your internet browser and go to the pigeonhole.at. Key in our event passcode, which is UAlive. I repeat, it is UALIVE. Click go and you are free to fire away all your burning questions or vote for a quick question that interests you. We are very honored to have with us Dr. Unni Karunakara, Senior Fellow of the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs of Yale University and Visiting Professor at Manipal University. Dr. Karunakara has been a humanitarian worker and public health professor for 2 decades. Tonight, we will draw on his extensive experience in the delivery of healthcare to neglected populations affected by conflict, disasters, and epidemics in Africa, Asia, and the Americas to discuss the challenges humanitarian workers face in providing life-saving assistance to those affected by the conflict and what needs to be done fast. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome on stage Dr. Karunakara.
Great. So it's wonderful to be here. When President Tan invited me, we've been friends for a few years now, and he's been very kind, and he invited me. I thought it would be a great opportunity to come and talk about the work that I do in the past 20 years. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yep. For the past 20 years. So what I'm going to quickly do is just give an introduction to perhaps the discussion that I hope it'll be a rich discussion. It's what is humanitarian action, what are the principles, what are some of the challenges as I see it, and then of course we can go into there'll be enough time for discussion, right? So let's talk about humanitarian action. You probably hear the term all the time. What exactly is humanitarian? So, who used to be the professor of global health at Harvard University, defined it as a moral activity grounded in of assistance to those in need. It's basically helping people out who are in a difficult situation. But it's a bit more than that. We all do charity work in countries and communities we live in, but humanitarian assistance has that additional element of crossing borders and expressing solidarity with people who are very different from you and are going through a very difficult time. Now, but in addition, humanitarian action is, but it must demonstrate an ethic of restraint, and by that I mean it's devoid of politics. There are no political interests, there are no military rationale, so humanitarian assistance in today and for most countries, it's an policy, but we conceive of humanitarian action as an impartial action which is purely meant to help people, part of a large foreign policy objective, right? And humanitarian action is therefore smaller. It's not development work. So distinction between humanitarian action and development work. So, is it? Okay, so humanitarian workers, just to simplify things, humanitarian workers alleviate suffering, development workers alleviate poverty. I hope you get the distinction, because alleviating poverty means, will necessarily mean that you're tackling the root causes. Humanitarian workers don't do that, or don't claim to do that. Or, as a medical humanitarian, further simplify it, humanitarians treat patients, development workers treat systems, right? Now, the deep radicalism of humanitarian action is the belief that people are not made to suffer. Now, if you look at all of the big religions, suffering is a big part of the religious experience, all big religions, right? And humanitarian action, and this is also in somehow, sort of chaotic in the sense that, suffering is part of human life, but unnecessary suffering, with no fault to you, what's happening in Syria now. A lot of the people who are caught in the conflict between Assad and the rebels and the ISIS, etc., right? Unnecessary suffering, unnecessary killing, and there's no need. People don't have to suffer. So that's a radical sort of notion that we humanitarians hold very dear. And this is David Reef in his book wrote about this. Now, the 4 principles of humanitarian action. Some of these pictures can be a bit shocking, but that's the reality out there. And if you want to talk about it a bit more, we can do that later. So there are 4 principles of humanitarian action. The first one is humanity, and I just talked about it, that the belief that all human beings, no matter their religion, no matter their politics, no matter their caste, creed, etc., deserve a life of respect and dignity, right? All people, anywhere in the world. So that is a core belief that drives humanitarians. Second principle is impartiality. The only criteria for deservedness of aid is need. It's not your politics, it's not your religion, it's not anything else. If you have need, and and the principle of impartiality also compels us to provide medical care to combatants. If they are injured, if they come to hospitals, we provide care. We don't make political judgments. We don't take positions, right? And that comes to the next principle of neutrality. We don't take political positions in times of conflict, because very often it's not clear what exactly, like Congo today, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys? It's very difficult to know, and you don't really need to know as a humanitarian. And it's also, as doctors, we are bound by medical ethics. If a person is in need of medical care, we are bound to provide that care. So 3 principles: humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and the last one is independence. Why, if we are working in Afghanistan, we are not there to further the interests of the Americans. If we are working in the Congo, we are not there to further the interests of the French, right? So this means that in all of the countries where we work, we talk to all actors, all parties to conflict. In Afghanistan, we speak to the Taliban, we speak to the US government, we speak to the Afghan government, because it is important for all parties involved to understand our impartiality and neutrality, that we are not there as political actors, we're there as humanitarian actors. That is what gives us the space to act, the humanitarian space. That is also in some way protects us. When communities understand and accept that we are there to help them and to provide health care, they're more likely to protect us. So that element of protection is also implicit in, that's why it's important for us to be independent. One element of independence in practice is independence of funding. So we don't take money from the US government. We don't take money from the French government. In fact, we now, perhaps there are 2 governments who
currently fund some activities. 98% of our funding comes from individual sources, people sending in $20 a month or 30 euros a month, right? And we're talking 1.4 billion euros a year. So that's a lot of people, 6 million people around the world who donate on a regular basis. So people are concerned about the issues out there. Now, a little bit about the organization that I've been associated with for the last 20 years, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. It's the single largest medical humanitarian organization in the world. Now, there are two missions. One is direct medical action. We provide medical care to people who are affected by conflict, right? Now, we are not an organization that funds other people to provide care. Our teams, our doctors, our nurses, our psychologists provide care to people affected by conflict, people affected by natural disasters, right? People affected by epidemics. Because in a lot of the countries which are not very well resourced, a small epidemic or even a moderate-sized epidemic can overwhelm the public health system, and occasionally they need help to cope with it. So we work and we respond to epidemics. And of course, the last big one, you probably heard about the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and that was a massive outbreak, and all of the countries involved were overwhelmed, and MSF doctors and nurses and a whole team of people helped treat patients in West Africa. And of course, in conditions of neglect. Unfortunately, there are many countries in the world today where groups of people are neglected, or they do not have access to healthcare, or they're excluded from the system. So these are also places where MSF comes in and provides healthcare, right? Partly to put a spotlight on the problem and also to work with governments to find lasting solutions, right? Now, in addition to direct medical action, we also bear witness. This is James Obinsky, a predecessor of mine. He was also president of MSF. When we received in 1999 the Nobel Prize, this is what he said: "We are not sure that words can always save lives, but we know that silence can certainly kill." And this also because in many situations we are the only outsiders in places providing healthcare, or any outsider in a place like Darfur or a remote part of South Sudan or Central African Republic. There's no one else from outside who actually sees what's going on. And so we also feel that it's a responsibility of sorts to put again a spotlight on problems that people face, so that international communities can come together and find solutions for these problems. So this is what we do: two things: direct medical action and bearing witness. Now, Michael Barnett in his book talks about the different phases, different periods of humanitarian action or humanitarian thinking. And you can see that before the Second World War, we were in the mode of the three C's. It was commerce, Christianity, and civilization. The colonials went far and wide, from Europe to Africa and to Asia and to Latin America, to civilize the natives, but also to spread Christianity, right? But if you look at between the end of the Second World War and the end of the Cold War, right, the Cold War period, the concern was sovereignty, partly because suddenly between the 40s and 60s, there were many new countries that were formed. In fact, the membership of the UN tripled during that period. So all of these newly formed countries were concerned about keeping their borders intact, right? No matter what went inside, the borders were sacrosanct. So, human rights violations, etc., was less important than than the borders. Then, of course, the post-World War period, it was all about human rights. So much so that the UN also formulated the right to protect, R2P, that governments had a responsibility not just to protect borders, but to protect people. And if governments failed, the international community might see it their responsibility to go in and protect, right? But I would like to go further. So if you ask me, post 9/11, we are in a new period. We're in a period where security is the overriding concern. And counterterrorism laws, etc., are being formulated in a very restrictive way. In fact, this cartoon, which appeared in a French daily, talks about liberté, égalité, fraternité, and sécurité. Because if you see what's going on in France today, even the whole discussion about hijab, etc., the fundamental European values are now being overridden because there's a global climate of fear. And counterterrorism legislations in Europe and in the US, and even in where I come from, in India, are sometimes impinge upon the rights of people. And we seem to accept it. Our privacy laws of, people, everybody reads our emails now, and our calls are being monitored, etc., and we seem to accept it, right? So the national laws are becoming increasingly restrictive, but also draconian in many places. Now, on the 3rd, exactly 1 year ago, on the 3rd of October last year, our hospital in Kunduz was bombed by US Air Force. And 42 people died, and 12 of my colleagues died that day. But others were patients and attendants, people who had come to help the patients out. Now, what we are seeing increasingly is a global climate that disrespects international norms and international conventions and international laws. So there is an erosion. There's a lack of respect for these norms, which we all international community worked very hard to create over the last 100, 150 years, right? So here you can see that any attack on a hospital or a medical facility in times of war can be seen as a war crime. I want to show you a short video clip which
This place was like a cradle for the poor people of Kunduz in this area. Much of the families cannot afford to treat their patients.
We will not leave patient behind, and we will not be silent. Seeking or providing healthcare must not be a death sentence.
معمولا هغه خلک چې طبي خدمتونو ته لاسرسی نه لري د اقتصادي ضعیف دي او لږ پرتو سیمو کې دي یعنې صرف یوازینۍ شفاخانه وه چې هغه بدون د تعویضه بدون د نجاته بدون د تور و سپین بدون د مخالف و موافق
So what is clear here is, so bombing hospitals, of course we are affected because our hospitals are destroyed. But humanitarian workers can get on a plane and leave, right? It's the people who continue to live in Kunduz. And local doctors and health workers, like in Syria, the white helmets, etc., they're the ones who bear the biggest brunt of what's going on. So we need to keep that in mind. So we can come and go. So we are in many ways the mouthpieces, but the people who really suffer are the people who live there. You saw the numbers. Now, part of the problem is also when we talk about respect and when we talk about attacks is the way counterterrorism laws define enemy combatants. And I'll just give you one example, and we can talk about it a bit later, is Obama administration's definition of an enemy combatant. Counts all military-age males in a strike zone as combatants unless there is explicit intelligence posthumously proving them innocent. So you kill them first, and then, so you have these sort of numbers. So the conservatives, they claim that only 102 people 102 civilians have been killed in that period, while the Pakistan Body Count, a very respected project, talks about 2,089 civilian fatalities. So that they're counting the same events, but the definition you use, of course, determines the reality or the truth, right? So that's just one example. Now, of course, what is happening is you know, in Syria and places like that, bombs are dropped every single day. Just in the last week alone, 4 hospitals in Aleppo were destroyed. 4 hospitals, right? So people are leaving Syria and other places in large numbers. Even Lebanese people are leaving because in Lebanon today, 1 out of every 4 person is a refugee. Even Lebanese youth are finding it hard to find jobs in their own country. So they're also getting on boats and going to Europe, right? Now, these are some of the images, people taking very risky sort of journeys, voyages across the sea and across land, and faced with a lot of violence, right? And this is happening as we speak. This is Calais in France. These are people who are living in camps waiting to somehow get across the channel to the United Kingdom. Now, this is despite the fact that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is absolute must, and all countries are signatories to this. It is one of the criteria for membership in the United Nations. They say everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. So people fleeing a well-founded fear of persecution have the right to seek asylum, right? And what is happening in Europe today is that governments, including the Scandinavian countries, who used to kind of claim the moral high ground on human rights issues, are now putting obstacles in the way of refugees so that they don't come to their doors and kind of knock and ask for asylum. So this is, but it's not just Europe, I have to say. Even closer to home in this region, the plight of Rohingya refugees is something that we need to sort of wake up to and try and understand it better. So, but in spite of these guarantees, this is what especially British journalism is. You can read the headlines for yourself. Denmark dumps Geneva Convention. So when push comes to shove, people, again, this whole climate of fear, I think, governs the decisions that they make on refugees, etc. Well, I think only 2 leaders have shown moral courage. I think Angela Merkel in Germany has shown a lot of courage in taking refugees. She might pay for it in the next election. And Sweden is the other country, I think. And now, of course, now Canada, Justin Trudeau has taken in a lot of refugees.
we had a boat coming directly at us, completely full of panicked people. It was so stressful for everyone that they jumped onto us and we had to pull people out of the water. And then when they came to our rescue vessel here, everyone was in a state of panic and started climbing and fighting, and it was a complete mess. We had to rescue 9 boats, plus a small wooden boat. But in the area there was an additional maybe 10 other boats. It was an incredibly complicated situation. Several rescue vessels got involved in the end. But I have never seen anything like this in my time here on the Central Mediterranean. Never.
So we have 3 boats in the Mediterranean now. Just 2 days ago, just one day, we rescued 720 people. Just one day. So you can imagine the scale of the problem. And people take risky voyages because governments are putting blocks in, so they have no choice but to get on a boat and come across. That's the only way they can do it. Now, as I wind up, as I sort of come to the end of my presentation, I just want to point out a few things. There are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. A bunch of doctors going and providing health care cannot be the solution to these problems, right? Humanitarian workers are there because it's emblematic of political failure. We are there because the system has failed. If the system was working, we don't need to be there, right? So it's emblematic of failure when the political has failed. Humanitarian action, therefore, is a necessary and essential civil society response to political failure, right? So humanitarians are not solution. I mean, very often I get asked the question, so what are you trying to solve the problem? It's not our job to solve the problem. It's all of those people sitting in the UN. It's all of those people who go to meetings at ASEAN and SAARC and all these regional groupings. They come together, but they're unable to find political solutions to some of the biggest problems affecting humanity today. Humanitarian action does not allow us to forget the suffering of others. Instead, it stands in solidarity. It defies the politics of invisibility and indifference. I think that's also what I referred to earlier. Just because we are present there, it's almost our responsibility to talk about what's going on there. Otherwise, if we don't talk about it, very often a lot of these problems will be invisible and away from the public eye. Thank you. Oh, one more. Just to give you a sense of what Aleppo is like today.
Thank you, Unni. How's that for a reality check? I think it should make us feel guilty, not for standing up and doing something about it, for not even thinking about it. So thank you, Unni, before we even start this conversation. Thank you for awakening us. Things have been so comfortable in this air-conditioned environment that we forget the heat that's generated outside. And some of the pictures you've shared with us, can't even believe that they're real. Sitting here, 15th August this year, Yemen, Hajjah Governorate, 19 dead, ABS Hospital. 6th August this year, Syria, 13 dead, 4 hospital staff members, 5 children, 2 women, 70,000 people deprived of essential medical care. 10th January this year, Yemen, 6 dead, 7 wounded, Shiara Hospital. 2nd December last year, Yemen, MSF clinic, 9 injured. 28th November last year, Syria, 7 dead, 47 wounded, including 23 women, children under 15 years old. And not to mention Afghanistan, 3rd October last year, 42 dead, including 24 patients, 14 MSF staff members, and 4 caretakers. How do you deal with this? These are people you know, people who have joined you. How do you deal with the emotions as you deal with the profession?
It can all get overwhelming at moments, and definitely October last year was such a moment. I remember also in Afghanistan, staying with Afghanistan, in 2004, 5 of our people were killed, also in Afghanistan. And when I was president, we had 2 nurses kidnapped in Somalia.
Yeah.
We had 2 of our colleagues killed in Mogadishu. As humanitarians, we're all cognizant of the risk involved in providing humanitarian assistance. But we also, as an organization, take a lot of measures to mitigate those risks. We try really hard to make sure that people who go, because we're not martyrs, we are humanitarian workers. We want to come back home, we want to be with our families, etc. So, but we also have to realize, is our risk as humanitarian workers more than the risk that people living in those countries face?
Yeah.
And that's also, and we are loath to asking for special privileges or special protection for people like us just because we come from outside. We are there to stand in solidarity with people. But what we are seeing in Syria today is that you are targeted for being a doctor. The only other profession with similar mortality rates are journalists.
Yeah.
Because they're committed to bringing out the truth. So these are very inconvenient professions for people waging war, because their strategy of war is to erase even the last sanctuaries of humanity in the midst of war.
And normalcy.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Basically, you don't want things to get back to normal,
and if
you won't have a cause for war.
Yeah, and you want to destroy morale, right?
Yeah.
And you want to destroy morale. So, it is hard. And I remember in '95, when I was a humanitarian worker for the first time in Ethiopia, so there was also conflict going on. We were able to negotiate truce for days at a time so that we could vaccinate children.
Yeah.
So we negotiated, we said, okay, look, stop fighting for 2 days. We'll come in with a white flag, we'll vaccinate children, we go back, and then, they resume hostilities or whatever that they do. That seems almost impossible today.
Why?
I think I think there is sort of an ideological divide in the world today. There is no trust left anymore. Even humanitarian workers are not trusted, because humanitarian workers themselves are to blame to some extent, because some so-called humanitarian workers work with US-funded programs in Afghanistan, or French-funded programs in Congo, etc., and they are there to implement certain development agendas. So in Afghanistan today, let's just examine that in detail. If you are working for a US-funded program, you are able to work in areas that are under the control of the government.
Yeah.
How much of Afghanistan today is under the control of the government? It's no wonder, or it's a good reason why the president of Afghanistan is called the mayor of Kabul, right? Just last week, Taliban, on the anniversary of the bombing, Taliban just walked into Kunduz and, they showed their mind. So, in fact, Taliban controls more territory today than it did 10 years ago. Like, that's the reality. So you can't go in and just provide assistance or impose a development agenda on one half, even 1/3 of the country.
So would you say a lot of this development you're talking about, where you find it increasingly difficult to negotiate, right, for truce?
Yeah.
Is it because there are a lot more non-state players?
Yeah. So the important point here, when humanitarian assistance is politicized or instrumentalized, hearts and minds strategy, etc., then it also becomes a target of war.
Yeah.
Right? Because people in Afghanistan then see it as a political tool. They are not neutral, they're not impartial. So who gets caught? We also get caught.
In 2013, Unni, you were president, all right, of MSF, and in 2013, you had said that one of the toughest decisions, one of the most challenging, painful decisions you've ever had to make was to pull MSF out of Somalia.
Yeah.
Why was it such a tough decision?
Because if ever there is a country that needs humanitarian assistance, it's Somalia. They have not had an effective government for 25 years, I think now, and it's total chaos. I mean, there is some, you can see certain oasis of normalcy in some places, but largely it's a chaos. There's no government services. People are in great need of healthcare, education, basic services. And so there is a real need for an organization like MSF to be there and stand with the Somali people and provide care. And knowing that, and we had at that time 10 projects in Somalia. We knew that pulling out from Somalia meant that there will be many places where there will no longer be health care, and people will surely die because of the lack of health care. And for humanitarian workers, that is a very, very difficult decision. And we had been in Somalia for 22 years.
And how many people do you estimate were left stranded without medical care or help?
We're talking hundreds of thousands of people, maybe 500,000.
So what happens to them when you exit?
Nothing.
Because you create a vacuum, right?
Yeah, it's a total vacuum.
So nothing, there won't be anyone else who could step in?
No, I mean, it's not we are very often the first organization to get in and the last organization to get out. And if we are getting out, that means it's very difficult for other organizations to be there as well. Because we have probably some of the best capacity to manage security, etc., etc. It's not because we have, we are not in Somalia today. All of the other countries where we work, we don't have armed guards. Our security comes from negotiating space with all of the parties involved, negotiated access. So that gives us the security. And also keeping our ears on the ground, understanding what's going on, and taking preventive action. That's what protects our people.
And I guess also because you are well known and respected and established entity, MSF, you also have the negotiating leverage.
Sure, but if you're a village in Afghanistan,
No.
and
Yeah.
your car looks like the Red Cross car, your flag is also white with some red blob in it. For a villager in Afghanistan, it doesn't really make much difference. I mean, for them, it's just some people from outside coming to help them, right?
Yeah. You have, more than 35,000 volunteers, right?
Yes.
Could you share with us how this is organized? When you say volunteers, do they volunteer for a period, a minimum period of, say, 6 months? Are they paid?
Yeah.
What makes them want to volunteer? How does one volunteer?
Sure. So, as Vishwa said, we have about 35 to 37,000 people in about 70 countries. And before I get into those details, I want to say that 1/3 of this, the large number of people who volunteer for MSF is medical. That means that doctors, nurses, psychologists, professionals who actually interact with patients. 1/3 is paramedical. They are lab scientists, epidemiologists, etc., etc. And 1/3 is non-medical. These are logisticians, accountants, lawyers, journalists, etc., etc. Because it really takes all of them to provide good quality medical care in the places where we work. Now, when I say volunteer, everybody gets some remuneration. The volunteer spirit comes from the fact that these are all professionals who could earn much more in their profession, in their home societies, but they choose to take time out. It could be for a few months, it could be for a few years. They take time out and they go and sort of express their humanitarian impulse in these places. So, and our teams are international. So it's not just all people from Europe coming to work in Africa and India, but it's also Indian doctors in Haiti and Ugandan doctors in Myanmar. So it is really an international team of doctors and logisticians who really work hard to provide care in these places.
Yeah. And are there Asians, sufficient Asians, or are we fairly well represented?
It's increasingly the number of Asians working in MSF is going up every year. It's also a recognition, I think. So before, the first 40 years of our existence, there were donor countries and there were project countries. So, for example, India and South Africa were seen, as countries where you do projects.
Yeah.
But now, increasingly, they also realize these countries are also incredible countries of resources.
Yeah.
Indian physicians, they know how to deal with tropical diseases better than European physicians.
Yeah.
80% of the drugs we use to treat patients come from India. So there are incredible resources coming from countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, and also Thailand, etc., that Singaporean doctors have, many of them have volunteered. So increasingly, countries are seen as not just project countries and donor countries, but countries where different, you can be a project country, but you can also be a country of immense resources. Japan is a case in point. When the Fukushima, everything happened. Even Japan, the most prepared country for natural disasters in the world, even they were overwhelmed for a few months. And we helped with mental health care and providing medical assistance for a few weeks and a few months.
Were you involved in the tsunami, in the Southeast Asian and South Asian tsunami?
So yes, we were. This is an interesting thing to keep in mind. So the distinction between, let's say, an earthquake in Haiti and a tsunami in, let's say, Indonesia. So in Haiti, thousands of people died. And they didn't die because of the earthquake. They died because of bad construction. They died because of the way the Haitian infrastructure is. So killing a lot of people. But tsunami is a completely different thing in the sense that after the tsunami is over, either people are alive or dead. They're not injured, right? So we struggled a little bit to find our role in the post-tsunami response, because a lot of the needs after tsunami were reconstructive in nature, right? Rehabilitating lives and livelihoods and all of that, building roads, schools, etc. And that's not something we do. In fact, the public were immensely generous. We got 110 million euros in the first week alone, and we actually had to send a letter to everybody saying, we can't use this money. You may want to give it to someone else, because what we do is healthcare, and we don't do reconstructive work that much. We are much more of an emergency medical care provider.
On a lighter note, you also shared that until very recently, your parents were still telling you when you're going to get a proper job.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
My father used to tell me until the end, so when are you? Do you have any plans of getting a proper job? We can offer you one in NUS perhaps,
Yeah.
It's quite proper, right, the job?
Yeah. No, I'm now, I teach at Yale University, and in the past 2 years I've come to NUS, coincidence, I don't know what, I've come here several times, so I've always been impressed by what's going on here. But what is normal these days? It's not, in my parents' generation, it was all about getting that government job and keeping it for the rest of your life. I think all of us today, we live long enough to have 3 different careers and do different things and cater to different interests. So there's no such thing as normal in
but
today's world.
What made you go into this, or how did you get into this line?
So when I was a medical student, I realized that health, and especially public health, has very little to do with medicine. Medicine is about illness and disease. It's about treating illness. Public health is about wellness.
Yeah.
It's about how do you keep people healthy. It's a very different thing, right? Medicine is a small part of the overall field of health. And increasingly, as a medical student, I was sort of thinking I couldn't articulate it very well, and I hadn't read enough. I felt that there had to be a different way of people getting sick, in the first place. So prevention, public health. So that's how I was studying to be a radiologist. I was actually studying for my Royal College exams in radiology. I left that to study public health. And my parents didn't know I had given up radiology till I graduated. So that...
Sounds quite familiar. Yeah. Okay.
No, so that I think was an eye-opener for me.
What year was this?
This
84?
was in 93, 95.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, in India today, one of the biggest causes of mortality in India is road traffic accidents. But the solutions for road traffic accidents don't lie in the Ministry of Health. It's how you build your roads, how do you, et cetera, right? Pollution, again. Of course, you can treat people with asthma, etc., but that's sort of refusing to see the larger problem. How do you bring down emissions? How do you cut down air pollution, noise pollution, etc.? So what I'm trying to say here is that the social, economical, political factors that impact health are, for me, way more interesting to engage and way more rewarding to engage in than, let's say, being a doctor in a hospital.
A practicing doctor in that.
So it also comes down to temperament. Some people are exceptional clinicians and they do very well and they can bring empathy and they can, be... I'm an equal opportunity offender, as I tell people. So for me, I was better suited to, that I had that political sensibility about health, I suppose, more than the clinical sensibility.
Yeah, but it also takes a person who's able to cross disciplines.
Yeah.
You know, cognitively, to be able to cross disciplines, to be able to understand these things. Not everyone can do, I mean, you're being quite modest, not everyone can do what you have managed to do.
And that was another reason why. So in India, just like in Singapore, you're forced to choose early, right? So you're straight out of school, you go to medical school, medical college, and you're in the sciences. So even while you're at school, the last few years, you're already forced to choose certain streams. And I always had the feeling when I was studying medicine that I was missing in education.
Yeah.
And public health was a bridge from the sciences to the social sciences, where you actually had to engage with economics, politics, history, culture, anthropology, sociology, etc. Because it's all of that is important to understand why human beings make the decisions they make and how they are able to be healthy or not healthy, etc. Right? So that for me was, a late education or rounding of my education, so to speak. So
okay, I just want to, before we transit to you guys, I see some doctors who have crossed borders here as well. I'm going to pick on you guys. You don't know who you are yet. I'm just curious. How many of you would consider doing some form of humanitarian work, joining an organization like MSF? Like, doesn't have to be MSF. How many of you would consider it, regardless of whether you are in the medical profession? Not bad. How many of you are lying? But that's great. And perhaps at the end of this conversation, you can share some give us some ideas on how we can sign up, what we can do, what roles we can play, where do we start? You chanced upon it, right? I mean, you want to share that? That's very quickly.
So I was telling Mishra earlier how I started working with Doctors Without Borders. So in '85, when I was a medical student, that was the time of the great Ethiopian famine. Many of you in the audience probably heard about Band-Aid, the big Bob Geldof concerts that were raising money for famine in Ethiopia. So those days, no internet, no TV even in India at that time. So we used to listen to the news on the radio. So BBC World Service had this reportage on MSF. And, and then soon after that, Time magazine had a cover story on French doctors who were providing healthcare in, taking incredible risks and providing care, etc. So very impressed me a great deal. So I wrote to BBC World Service, asked them for MSF's address. So 2 months later, a letter came with the address. I found a typewriter somewhere. I typed it out, letter out, sent it snail mail to Paris. Never heard back. Then life went on, radiology, then I wandered into public health. 94, I got an internship.
Yes, 10 years later.
10 years later, I got an internship to work with the African National Congress in South Africa. 94, important year, because that was the year Mandela assumed his presidency, New South Africa. And at that time, there was a tremendous international goodwill, and there were groups of experts and people from all over the world in South Africa helping ANC and Mandela create policies for the New South Africa. So I was a student and I was working with a team working on certain aspects of health policy. Great summer. On my way back, I happened to be at the airport in Brussels and I started talking to some chap, and he happened to be with MSF, and we got talking and he said, well, you should come and work for us. So pretty soon, I got a letter from him offering me a position in Ethiopia. I still had a year back to finish my public health degree. I finished all my requirements and all the papers in 4 months, and I was I didn't even stay for my graduation. I was off to Ethiopia. So that was a chance opportunity, and I didn't want to pass up on it. So I really made the effort to get out of New Haven, Yale at that time, and head to Ethiopia. It's the single most important decision I made. And I have to admit, when I first went to Ethiopia, it was more of an adventure for me. Going to Africa, doing this kind of work, I thought was really interesting, a lot of conversation, interesting things to talk about. But that 1 year completely changed my life. After seeing what I saw in Ethiopia, it became very difficult for me to practice healthcare or medicine in any other way. So it was just one of those big, momentous sort of, year in my life where everything changed.
Thank you. With that, throw it open to the floor. Are you stumped or? Oh, yeah. Go to the mic. Your name.
Hello. My name is Song Lin. I'm a recent graduate from the Bachelor of Environmental Studies program here at the US. Thank you, Dr. Karunakara, for your sharing. Just now you talk about how the public can get involved. I know we can volunteer, we can donate money and do things like that. But as you mentioned that humanitarian work is not the solution to the problem. The actual problem is actually the failure of the political structure. How do we solve that? How do ordinary citizens like us help to solve the political problem, the bigger problem? Thank you.
So, absolutely, to reiterate what I said earlier, humanitarian work is not the solution to humanitarian problems, but it's still essential action because you need, even in the worst moments faced by humanity, you have to show that there is a possibility for, expressions of solidarity, etc. So it keeps people alive, it keeps hopes alive. So it's very, very important action. And it also tells the world that they're failing. So it's very important. Now, again, not everybody has to get on a plane and go to the Middle East or go to Africa to be a humanitarian. I think what is really important is to engage. The more I travel to all of these places, the more I realize how policies made in Washington and Brussels have a big impact on the lives of people in Central African Republic or in Congo, right? So I think there is a big role to be played by citizens to engage, be aware, and then engage and keep politicians and keep policymakers sort of honest and be. And earlier I was saying that I think there is the problem with leadership today globally is that we define national interests in a very narrow way, that we are unable to see, unable to frame national interest in a more inclusive way. Why is American national interest, why does it have to come at the expense of the interest of people in Africa or the Middle East? Why can't American national interest be also in the national interest of the Middle East or in the national interest of Africa, right? There's almost a zero-sum game attitude in a lot of the things we do. So we need to, that's I think, sort of lack of imagination, political imagination, I would say. Now, having said that, I think there is, for example, students in my university where I teach at Yale University, they do really interesting stuff. So one of the things that, moving away from conflict for a second, the other challenge we face, even when we are able to get to patients living in some of the poorest parts of the world, we don't always have the right medicines and tools to treat them. That is because, A, the medicines are largely created for people in rich societies. Second, these tools are not really made for poor countries. Yeah. So, for example, if insulin needs to be refrigerated and kept between a certain degree centigrade, and you can forget rolling it out in in rural Tanzania or rural India for that matter. Because how many people have electricity? How many people have refrigeration? So one of the things that we are doing with the money that we got from the Nobel Peace Prize in '99, we set up what's called the Campaign for Access to Essential Medicines, where we push, fight, cajole, and work with pharmaceutical companies to provide tools that are appropriate. New medicines, new therapies, new lab tests that are appropriate for people living in poor countries. Now, students at Yale were the ones who were instrumental in pushing Yale University to give up their royalty rights to AZT, which is a drug that was absolutely essential, in the first therapy that was rolled out in Africa and other parts of the world. The 3 drugs, one of them was AZT. And the only way, in 1999, the cost of treating one person for a year for HIV/AIDS was between $10,500 and $15,000. Who can afford that? In 1999, there was not a single person in the continent of Africa who was receiving publicly funded HIV treatment.
So how much would a generic drug cost?
Yeah. Today, it's less than $100. That is because combination of things. First of all, the prices came down. How did the prices come down? Because an Indian generic company came and said, we will make this drug $1 a day. That was already $360 a year. And then it's been a slide since then, and now it's less than 100. So, and as a result, today, there are, I think, about 13 million people on HIV treatment around the world. So massive changes have happened. And that also, and students have played a big role in it. And civil society, these are people who never got into a plane and they didn't fly to Africa, but they recognized the problem. They pushed pharmaceutical companies. One thing pharmaceutical companies and increasingly also universities listen to are their investments and share prices and etc. So students, when they are organized, can be a powerful force in pushing companies and also universities to behave responsibly. So that's just one example. There are a lot of other things that can be done. So all I want to say is that you can sit behind your computer, and today young people foment revolutions sitting in their bedroom. So I think there is no lack of things for you guys to do.
Thank you. Yes, the gentleman in white.
Hi, I'm a graduate student in international relations. I have 2 questions.
Your name?
My name is Amos.
Sorry?
Amos.
Amos.
Yep. The first question is about local approaches in humanitarianism. So I think in the humanitarian world, there's a lot of talk about how can organizations be more participatory, especially when you have a very international team working in complex local situations. So I was wondering, how does this apply to MSF, especially in a very medical kind of context? The second question is more personal. I was wondering if you could share with the audience about what are some of the most rewarding instances you've had throughout your career as a humanitarian worker, either in the field or in the office, and what are some of the most challenging moments, and how do you cope with them? Thanks.
Okay, I need 2 hours for that.
Well, how about 2 minutes?
Yeah. So let's take the first question. Participatory approaches, it's absolutely important. But first of all, MSF as an organization, international organization, to participate and to engage and to be collaborative, you need local partners, right? Very often in a lot of the places where we work, we are there because the local structures don't exist. So we don't have a Ministry of Health that we can work with. We don't have civil society that we can work with, right? So that is one big problem. But even in places where some elements of those different stakeholders are present, we have not been very good at collaborating. Part of it is we are an emergency organization. We are an 800-pound gorilla. We're just so focused on just getting the job done. It's emergency, and then we get out, right? But there are instances where we have, South Africa is a good example, where when we started providing HIV care in South Africa, it was illegal to treat patients. And then we can go into why that was the case. But it was illegal. We actually smuggled in drugs in the country to put first patients on treatment, right? And we were almost taken to court, etc. But that action and working together with South African civil society, activists, etc., today South Africa provides free treatment for all people affected by HIV/AIDS. So collaboration was absolutely key, and participation of patients themselves who can vocalize their own life and their own plight and bring their own stories. It's absolutely powerful. I mean, it's way more powerful to have someone from Syria stand here and tell you about what's going in Aleppo than me standing here. Right?
Just a small, mischievous, heretical idea.
Yeah.
Since many of these armed forces, state-sponsored or militia, don't seem to care very much for the international conventions like the Geneva Conventions, why should organizations like you care for patent rights and enforcing patent rights?
No, well, we don't really.
If it's grossly unfair,
yeah.
And if this is something that you feel you need to do, how is it going to be enforced against you?
So the thing is, we don't care about, we are not against patents, but what we are against is monopoly.
Yeah.
It's monopoly that keeps the prices up.
And quite often is related.
Yeah, exactly. And we have been very vocal against it. We have tried to break patents wherever. So bringing drugs into South Africa and treating patients was an element of that.
Yeah.
Taking the fight to corporate boardrooms and to WHO boardrooms, etc., to force the issue of patents, and how patents and monopoly together was. In fact, there's a great movie that you should all watch called Fire in the Blood. Talks about how the pharmaceutical companies may have perpetuated. I mean, he uses a very strong term, but almost a genocide. Millions of people in millions of people affected by HIV/AIDS in the continent of Africa have died as a result of pharmaceutical company policies. Right? So this is something that we are very strong about. We take this on. Personal stories, there are just too many to recount, and I think you mentioned one where Somalia was, my first mission in Ethiopia. The people, the community I worked with was Somalis.
Yeah.
And my last big act before I left, stepped down as president, was to pull out of Somalia. It's sort of almost a full circle in a very bad karmic sort of way. And that has sort of left a deep impression on me. Almost always, the most rewarding stories that what sticks in your mind are there's one boy that you met, or there's one old woman you met. It's almost, it gets that personal. It's not that you went and you restored the public health system in Liberia or in South Sudan. I mean, that's just almost a pie in the sky. But I was also responsible and part of a team that developed a new therapy for sleeping sickness in Congo. So there are different scales of impact that you're part of at a personal level, but also at a big macro level, where this therapy is now global guidelines for treatment of sleeping sickness.
Yeah.
And so even if MSF doctors are not treating patients, the benefit of what we did is reaching way more people than we alone would have been able to reach.
Right. There are a couple of, the internet, I'm not getting internet here, the pigeonhole questions are coming. Shall I just read it out to you?
Sure.
Or you can put it up. This is doesn't speaking out on politics compromise the principle of neutrality?
Yeah. So absolutely. So when I talk about neutrality, I'm talking about political neutrality. I'm not going to Afghanistan and talking about the Americans or talking about the Taliban or talking against each one of them. Now, that's political neutrality, because that could affect our ability to be present and to provide care in a safe way, right? But we do, as an organization, take political positions, like, for example, patents, monopoly, right? Because public health is inherently political. We practice in Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, the medicine we practice, the healthcare we practice is political, right? Even when we decide we are going to start working in Yemen today, that is a political statement, because that is signaling to the world that something is rotten in the state of Yemen, right? So don't fool, we shouldn't fool ourselves by saying that, we can be completely neutral. In fact, if you read Dante's Inferno, a special place in hell was reserved for neutral people in hell. And that too, not in the cool part of hell, in the outskirts of hell, the really hot part of hell, and you were chased by hornets 24/7.
Actually, you should go to a Hopper villa. That is, I think, more scary.
Yeah.
Sitting in those oil pots, boiling hot oil pots.
Yeah.
We shall take you there. Remember, Bernard? Yeah.
No, but the distinction I want to make here, when Dante was referring to passive neutrality, where people were too lazy to even form an opinion. For us, neutrality is an active neutrality. We have to really try hard to be neutral. And it's very difficult to be neutral when you are witness to so many things.
Yeah.
And I don't think going to the United Nations Security Council and testifying about what's happening in Syria it's not being neutral. What you're doing is you are speaking for the people you're not speaking against Russia, you're not speaking against the Americans, but you are speaking for the people of Syria. So that should be very clear.
Is there, quite a few burning questions. 1, 2. When you go there together, anyone on this side? Okay. If you could stand by, because time is running out. If you just go there, we can get the questions rolling. Why don't we take both questions together, if you don't mind?
Hi, my name is Edwin. I'm actually not from NUS. I'm just crashing the party.
Okay, then you can stand behind. Okay.
Sorry. It's about bearing witness, testifying in the UN Security Council, for example. It is not neutral, definitely, but does that politicization of whatever you say in the UN Security Council, does that compromise the safety of your aid workers on the field? That politicization has it has backlash. It has.
You're taking sides because you would be aligned.
And then on top of that, does that compromise your future work in that particular region?
But how much worse can it get in Aleppo today? We are not able to work. People are being killed. Hospitals are being killed. There are 30 doctors left in Aleppo today, right? So it can't get any worse. This is a last-ditch attempt to get the world to do something about Aleppo, right?
Okay.
So I don't think it is essentially, it is a political act, but I don't think it puts anyone in jeopardy because people are already, it can't get worse for people in Aleppo today.
Yeah.
Right?
So neutrality doesn't mean that you don't take a stand.
Yes. Absolutely.
That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you don't take a stand.
But when you are in a political conflict, you don't take sides. You're not there to implement programs for the Americans. You're not there to implement programs for Taliban. I hope that distinction is clear, right? It doesn't mean that you zip it completely and you don't talk about what's going on. You do talk about it, but you are always on the side of the people. Right?
Well, and I think as Unni said, it's a struggle to maintain that neutrality because it's a neutrality with a stand, with an opinion. Right. Okay. Think about it. You look troubled, but later, over coffee, or if you're good, we'll give you a glass of whiskey as well. Yes.
Hi, good evening. My name is Leon. I'm actually not part of NUS as well, so I'm crushing this party.
What's wrong with you guys? Okay.
So, as you have previously mentioned in your speech, that there is an increasing lack of trust from governments and non-state actors in the regions of conflict they are working in, due to suspected political backing from countries like the US. So, can you share with us how does MSF actually negotiate with all these actors? Are there any limits imposed by these governments or state or non-state actors, and whether are there any concessions made by MSF in order to get access to all these conflict-affected areas?
Thank you.
Oh, very good question. Negotiating access is a lot of hard work. So just to give you an example, in 2004 we left Afghanistan because my colleagues were killed, and it took us 5 years to get back. Right? After Kunduz last year, we still haven't started operations because we haven't gotten the guarantees we need from all sides. Similarly, in Somalia, we are now, been talking with various parties in Somalia about how we can re-enter, re-engage, but we haven't gotten the guarantees we need. So it's a lot of hard work. Now, the really difficult task of providing humanitarian assistance is also a balancing act between being principled and being pragmatic. You can be very principled, but I can tell you if you're that principled, then you're just sitting at home. You won't be able to work anywhere. So you have to constantly, every single day, you're making compromises. When the government of Sri Lanka tells you that if you want to provide healthcare, during the last push, etc., that all your communications have to go through, has to be approved by the government, then is that a good price to pay? Well, yes, because ultimately, if you're not there with the people providing care, then you have nothing to speak about anyways, right? So you have to privilege human lives over, any other considerations you may have. And that's also another distinction between humanitarian workers and development workers. Humanitarian workers privilege human lives over human freedoms. So we are not really human rights workers. We're there to save lives. Freedoms and concerns about human rights come in after the people are alive, right? So just to stress that point again, compromises are made every single day. So
it's about being, it's not so much compromises, but a lot more to do with being pragmatic at that point, and being clear about what your priorities are, why you're there, a certain clarity of purpose, right? Yes.
Hi, Dr. Karunakara. I'm Jonathan from Relief Singapore, a local NGO, not from NUS, sorry. I've got two questions. One is, I'm just curious to know, since the founding of MSF, or perhaps recently, were there any incidents in the field that caused a very significant change in MSF standard operating procedures and thinking, perhaps in the areas of how you negotiate for access, logistics, and maybe medical personnel? Second question is, you mentioned that there are only 30 doctors in Aleppo. So if there are doctors in Singapore wanting to go in there to help out, what would you say to them? Forget it, or join MSF, or something?
No, okay, last question first. The reason there are only 30 doctors, it's almost impossible for people from outside to go and work there. We don't, it's not that people don't want to go. We have people knocking down on our doors saying that we want to volunteer and we want to help in Syria. It's just that so before our standard operating procedure you're talking about, we would, as part of our neutrality, we would tell all sides of parties, we would give them our GPS coordinates of our hospitals, our facilities, so that they know that this is a hospital, this is a safe space, etc., right? We don't do that in Syria anymore because the coordinates are used as a target, right?
So was that what happened in Kunduz? I mean, did MSF...
Okay, we will never know what happened in Kunduz because there has never been an independent investigation. But the US government have catalogued, it's like a litany of, a lot of errors that piled up to lead to this, at least that's what they're saying. But the fact is, it was a targeted strike. The building was precisely hit repeatedly, right? So now whether that makes for a deliberate attempt or it was a mistake, we don't know because there's never been an independent investigation. But they had the coordinates. They had the coordinates. Similarly in Syria. So today what we do in a lot of these places, we don't share our coordinates. A lot of the facilities are some run in basements of houses, buildings, etc., and publicized word of mouth, etc. So standard operating procedures sort of have changed because some of these bad experiences. But I can go into big picture issues. I mean, today states are getting stronger. In countries, India is a democracy, you have China, you have Russia, but they all have the same aversion to civil society action. Any kind of attempt to challenge government narratives about development, etc., is not taken very kindly. So Greenpeace is in trouble in India. We have occasionally gotten in trouble because we said certain things. So this is happening more and more. More governments are increasingly intolerant towards civil society action, but particularly international civil society action.
All right, thank you.
My name is Uma. I hope my question
can't hear you.
My name is Uma, and I hope my question is not too provocative. Do you think there are too many different humanitarian organizations?
Yeah.
That's it.
I mean, there are not enough humanitarians, but there are too many humanitarian organizations. I'll give you an anecdote. So after the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake, the cholera outbreak, etc., and it was completely being mismanaged by the WHO, etc., and all of the different agencies that were supposed to respond. So I led a delegation, MSF delegation, and we met with President René Préval of Haiti. And we had a discussion, and he said, after this meeting, I am going to chair a meeting of the health cluster, that is representatives of all of the different health agencies. There were 425 agencies, right? So now, that's a good thing. Even a church group in Kansas, they collect money in the church and they want to help people in Haiti. That must be a good thing. But the problem is, a lot of these organizations are unable to cope with the realities on the ground. So it's one thing to be well-intentioned. The missionaries who went to Africa were well-intentioned. But it's a completely different thing to actually, so wanting to do good and doing good are two different things, right? And that we need to, so capacity is important, local knowledge is important, and the ability to deliver is important. That's one element of it. But if you go to a country like Afghanistan today, everybody is a humanitarian. Halliburton is a humanitarian agency now because they get billions of dollars from the US government to provide humanitarian assistance. So they, just like MSF people, they don't wear uniforms, they go around in white cars, and they provide humanitarian assistance. The distinction being, they provide very often humanitarian assistance for military intelligence. If you don't help them, you don't get assistance. That is not humanitarian.
So it's negotiated humanitarian assistance?
No, it is not humanitarian. They're just there to get information, and they're using food and all of this as a bait. So there are humanitarian, so-called humanitarian organizations that do not respect any of the humanitarian principles. They're definitely not motivated by humanity. They're definitely not impartial because they seek something in return. They're definitely not neutral. They're taking sides, and they're definitely not independent. But they claim to be humanitarian. So today, even the military, I know, I have friends in Danish military. Young people today join militaries because they want to do good, because they say they have humanitarian missions, etc. Right? So there are a lot of people. I'm not saying soldiers are bad people, but of course they are part of a system, right, that has a very different objective than humanitarians have. And it is important to distinguish humanitarian activity from other forms of assistance. And I'm also not saying that US government, for example, or any occupying power should not provide assistance, because in fact it is their responsibility to take care of people who are under their control. Right? They have to provide basic services, etc. But let's be clear, that is not humanitarian assistance. That is their responsibility. If today one army comes and takes over Singapore, it's their job to make sure that Singaporeans have access to basic, services.
Would you be guilty? Might you be guilty of taking a rather puritanical approach to this? Because at the end of the day, if you take it broadly, they are also helping to save lives.
Yeah.
They are also helping to treat people
Yeah.
who may be injured. What's wrong with more hands on deck?
So that's precisely why I said that what they're doing is important, but I wouldn't call it humanitarian assistance. It is assistance, but of a different nature. Okay. So, for example, don't get me wrong. In Haiti, when we had the post-earthquake, the massive surgical needs, limbs need to be amputated, complicated surgeries too. We used to send our patients, some of our patients, to the U.S. Navy ship that was docked outside Port-au-Prince. So, they have the best capacity to do that kind of work, and we appreciated that, and we work with them, right? But it's very different situation in Afghanistan. The distinction here is when an army is in a humanitarian mode and an army is in a belligerent mode. When an army is in a belligerent mode, it is very difficult for an independent, neutral organization like us to associate with them.
Yeah.
Because it's not seen very
And they are partisan.
And they're partisan, obviously.
Okay. So, any other question from here? Yes. Are you allowed to ask a question? Okay. Did I see another hand there? Yeah. If you could just go to the mic. Would that be the last question from the audience?
Just to clear the deck, my name is Bernard. So, Unni, may I ask you this question? I mean, it's troubled me for a very long time, and it's something you're facing now. I mean, at some point, the world crossed the line, right? We live, at least for those of us who are old enough, we live at a time where when people saw a Red Cross or they saw a Green Crescent, it's a safe space. You don't hit it. When did we cross the line? Why? What caused that crossing of that line? And do you think we will ever be able to bring it back to this side of the line?
We crossed the line in World War II. We crossed the line when Rwanda happened in '94. We crossed the line when Srebrenica happened. We continuously seem to cross lines, which, the reason United Nations was created, it was created because we said never again will we allow a genocide to happen, right? But unfortunately, the UN has become more of a debating chamber rather than a body that is able to make decisions and enforce it. It's just the nature of politics. I think the UN Security Council, with its veto powers, etc., has made it sort of impossible for any kind of work to get done. So on the 3rd of May, we had UN Resolution 2268, right? And it again reiterated that health facilities are safe spaces. It need to be protected. Since that resolution, there have been several attacks against hospitals. So I don't know what the solution is. I mean, what more can be done, right? Part of the problem is that there are no moral guardians anymore. Or there are no, we don't live in a unipolar world anymore. The US is just one of many powers in the world today. It becomes very difficult to assert authority and also to hold a stick and say you can't do this. Becomes even more difficult when you are also guilty of committing some of those crimes. So I don't have a solution for this, but people have said, oh, we need a new Geneva Convention, we need a new refugee convention. If we were to renegotiate Geneva Conventions today or a new refugee convention, I can guarantee you what we will get today will be not as good as what we have. I think laws are not the problem. We have good sentiments and good conventions, everything on paper. It's just the lack of political will. And holding agencies accountable for failure. Right? If 800,000 people are allowed to be slaughtered in Rwanda, who is responsible? Right? Did we hold the UN responsible for not sending peacekeepers in time? Do we hold the UN Security Council members responsible for not sanctioning peacekeeping? I mean, there are many levels of responsibility. Ultimately, it'll come down to us, because it's our governments who are sitting there. It's our politicians who are sitting in New York and in Geneva.
Maybe the concept of the state needs to be neutralized with a global consciousness.
I think
generated on the net. It is possible, because even as we become global, paradoxically, there is a rise in nationalism. It's paradoxical, but it's happening. So there needs to be another force that's strong enough to neutralize the effect of these states looking very narrowly at self-interest. And states, by definition, look at self-interest. You can't change that. And that's really what's happening. So, but I think there's a new consciousness that may be arising on the net that could alter it and hopefully make the pendulum swing the other way, or start swinging the other way. If you could go to the last question. Yes.
My name is Brian. I'm a third-year medical student. So this question is asked on behalf of those in the healthcare industry and those training to be healthcare workers. So as medical students or junior doctors or nurses, for example, what do you think is the best way in which we can choose our career paths so that we can work towards a career that's revolved around humanitarianism or development? Like, for example, is there a specific specialty that is required or more useful in terms of humanitarian work? Yeah. Thank you.
Could I add a point to that? If you could also comment on how the medical school, how medical students could be better conditioned to do such work emotionally. I don't think it's about technical skills, it's about the emotional conditioning to have the capacity to feel, to empathize at a global level. Could I also just put it under your name, that question? Okay.
It's also, to add to that list of things that you elaborate, values. I mean, we go to, I think people still go to medical college with they have the right impulses. They want to heal and they want to, see healthy people, healthy communities, healthy societies, etc. But somewhere along the way, we lose our way. Somewhere along the way, we lose our values. We sort of get co-opted by the industry and a certain way of practicing medicine. And to resist that, you really need to be aware, and you really need to and in that sense, I think medical education really needs to look at how they incorporate, these socio-political elements, economic elements into medical education.
Yes.
That's not happening. So we do something called community medicine, but I think that's very narrow in its scope, and we need to in a medical education really sort of broaden it a bit. Specialties, I think, the first 40 years of MSF's existence, we were largely concerned with treating infectious diseases. So HIV/AIDS, tropical medicine, sleeping sickness, Kala-Azar, etc., pediatrics, obstetricians, gynecologists, and of course, in conflict situations, natural disasters, trauma surgeons, anesthetists, etc. But increasingly, the world is also changing. More and more people live longer. There are chronic conditions that affect people also in Sudan. So we now need people who can manage hypertension, diabetes. Don't forget mental illnesses, psychiatrists, psychologists. So I think there is no speciality. I think you can do whatever you want in medicine and do it well. And then, of course, what is more important than your education is that willingness to help, that wanting to help and then acting on it. So it's one thing. A lot of people want to do good, but make that call or get on the internet and put your name down and then and go for an information session which will give you more information about what this work is all about. Again, I want to reiterate, MSF is just one of many organizations out there. You have to find the right fit for you. Some people want to do long-term developmental engagement, which is also a worthwhile sort of endeavor, and that's also something that people need to engage in, right? So there are different ways of helping out, and you have to find that road for yourself. I took this particular path, and I'm incredibly it's been a rewarding sort of 20 years, but you will find your own path, and you will choose to engage in different issues. Climate change is another issue that young people are very concerned about, right? So there are many ways of, ultimately you're looking for, or you want to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem.
Just a quick question that's come here quite hot. Is it possible for a non-medical person to run for the post of MSF International President? Victor, is it from you?
So, not for the international president. And so far, all of the presidents have been doctors. Part of it is it's related to the medical identity of the organization.
It is called Doctors Without Borders.
Yeah.
Not geographians or whatever you call it.
Yeah. Geographers.
Geographers.
Yeah. So, but we have many non-medical people in senior positions. So, for example, the Secretary General of the organization, I think many of them have been non-medical. They've been journalists and sociologists and engineers, etc. So, there are many positions that you would find rewarding within the organization at the field level, but also at the headquarters level. But one thing is very important. You have to start in the field. You can't just go in and, because it is absolutely important the higher you go up. I mean, we don't like to call it higher because we try to flatten the organization. We don't see it as a hierarchy. MSF is unique in the sense that a lot of people individuals who were presidents have gone on later to do other positions in the field, etc., like a regular doctor, etc. So it's not just a one-way ladder. You can go sideways, you can go whatever. So so there are many positions for non-medical people, but start in the field, because whichever position you are, you need that sensibility. You need to have seen firsthand what the lives of people are and how they struggle and the challenges involved in providing medical assistance and other kinds of assistance in the field. So start in the field and then work your way to other positions.
Okay. Final question from here. Highest vote, most number of people have voted for this question, and I think it's a very appropriate final question. As a humanitarian worker, is there any way at all to mitigate the level of mental stress and emotional scarring that you get from going through your course of offering aid?
I think it is important to know yourself and to know your limits. And this is something that increasingly we talk to people about before they start out as volunteers and also when they come back from missions. And we train people how to detect stress in themselves, but also in their teammates. Right? I myself have coped by taking time out every now and then. My usual place of retreat has been universities, where I get out for 6 months, I read something. Sometimes I'm just at university, I don't do any work, I just go to the theater, all of that. But you need that space, whatever that space is, to remove yourself and to reflect a little bit on, and then you go back recharged, etc. And burnout rates are very high in the organization. And it's not more than what you would find among firefighters and other professions of extreme stress. And there are organizational, systemic ways of dealing with it. It's a question whether we deal with it very well. We are definitely trying to. But most important thing is that you need to know yourself and your limits. So I've always, when I think I'm reaching a point of burnout, I remove myself, take a break, maybe 6 months, a year, and then go back again. Always recharged and wanting to do more. Different ways of coping with it. One last thing I will tell you is, very often, and we all live in, I come from India, but in India, I lived a very privileged life. And we live in privileged societies as well. There's a tendency to go to some of these really deprived parts of the world and say, wow, that is the real life. Look at their real, my life means nothing. I should live in Africa, I should do this, and then you feel guilty for your own privileges, etc. I think you really need to be comfortable and negotiate between two realities. Your reality and your life is no less significant because other people have been disadvantaged. And you need to be comfortable with that you have your life and they have your life. The important thing is, in spite of your privilege, you are taking time out to express solidarity with people. And that, I think, it's a realization that some people arrive at, some people don't, and if they don't, they burn out. And that's just one element of it. It's just my own thinking. But it's important to be comfortable with who you are, know yourself, engage, but also, if it gets too much, don't be afraid to disengage. So I don't know, I don't have any more words of wisdom other than that.
Well, Dr. Unni Karunakara, thank you very much for sharing this with us. And you have most certainly brought humanity to the center of our consciousness. You've definitely helped us reflect. And this is not an overstatement. But the reason why this sharing has been so effective, at least for me, and I hope I'm speaking for quite a few of us, is the honesty with which you shared, minus the pomp. See, sometimes you have people who have done a lot of this, but the tone is preachy. But your tone retains that inimitable sense of authenticity, which is rare, and that in spite of all that you have done, witnessed, you have still managed to retain that personality that must always belong to Unni Karunakara. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. We are not going to let you go without something. Bernard Cho, who is Director of Office of Alumni Relations, will now give you a kiss.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll have you right in the center.
Right in the center, yes. It's lots of money. Thank you very much. Thank you. We'd like to invite you all to join us for a reception. Thank you. And to mob him. Thank you.
Ladies and
brilliant.
gentlemen,
Wonderful.
thank you for participating in today's U-Live session brought to you by NUS Office of Alumni Relations. For those with smartphones, do remember to leave your feedback on the session via the Pigeonhole application. To find out more about upcoming events at the Shaw Foundation Alumni House, do pick up our event collectorals located at the registration desk. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at the next U-Live session.